Hello, and thank you very much for joining our event. My name is Alejandro. I am a research fellow at ALNAP, leading our work on mutual aid. We are really excited to be launching our latest published synthesis on supporting mutual aid. This report is the first output of an ongoing 2-year research project where we will create multiple spaces to meet, learn, and discuss on this topic. As Juliet referenced earlier, we are amidst a very bleak scenario for the humanitarian sector. However, there has also been a rather encouraging attention by some actors within this international system on mutual aid. We argue that this may be because the two are more connected than we thought. Because what if better connecting the international system to already existing mutual aid efforts through which communities support one another can be part of the solution of how we reset and reprioritize the system? What is mutual aid? This is not a straightforward question. Last October, we spent 2 days in Bangkok with researchers and practitioners trying to answer it. And as you can see from the pictures in the slide, there's no single or simple definition. However, for the purpose of our research, we define mutual aid as the self-forming, self-organized, and voluntary ways in which individuals, families, and communities support one another during crisis. Anecdotally, during that workshop, there was a shared sense that although mutual aid is hard to pin down conceptually, when you experience it in your own context, you know it when you see it. This picture above is from Bogota, Colombia, which is where I'm from. During the first few months of the pandemic, a spontaneous but organized system of mutual support emerged. Across the city, and particularly in low-income neighborhoods, people who were struggling began hanging red shirts or pieces of clothing from their door to signal for help. It created a shared language that allowed others like me to know where we could drop off groceries or medicine. For me, this is a clear example of mutual aid. So now the question is to understand the evidence around how international funding can support mutual aid efforts. We realized this was fundamentally about a relationship between two systems. On one side, the organizations from the formal humanitarian system, and on the other, the mutual aid efforts themselves. And like any relationship, there are two sides or dimensions to this interaction. The first looks at the results experienced by mutual aid efforts as a result of support provided via international funding. And the second looks at the results experienced by formal actors as a result of the interactions that they have with mutual aid efforts through their support. Both dimensions form the basis of the report and its findings. SCLR, or Supporting Community-Led Response, emerged as the most common way through which mutual aid efforts in humanitarian contexts are currently receiving international funding. What is SCLR? The diagram from the report that you see on the slide presents our interpretation. In a nutshell, and without doing justice to the full level of nuance, SCLR is an approach or methodology through which international actors can provide support to existing mutual aid groups or initiatives. In very broad terms, international actors work with local facilitators, who are usually local or national organizations, who then identify existing mutual aid initiatives and invite them to apply for support. The support requested is not limited to microgrants. It can also include demand-led capacity strengthening, horizontal and vertical connections, and support for coordination. What is key is that the support, whatever form it takes, is characterized by flexibility, by being demand-led, and by a conscious effort to share risks and power. So back to the research. We first set out to identify all existing evidence on outcomes of supporting mutual aid with international funding. Initially, we expected that the evidence base was going to be very limited, as we had repeatedly heard that most of it was anecdotal or poorly documented. However, we expanded our scope and included internal evidence from those local facilitators. This gave us access to over 200 documents from more than 25 countries, all of which formed the basis for the analysis. So what did we find? Well, first, on the results experienced by mutual aid groups as a result of international support. The first finding is that support, when provided in the right way, was often seen to strengthen rather than undermine the areas that mutual aid is already inherently good at. These areas include resilience and sustainability, dignity and quality, and relevance. Resilience and sustainability were strengthened when support was forward-looking, demand-led, and deliberately focused on long-term thinking, collective action, and networking. Rafiqul Islam, a local facilitator of the SCLR approach in India, gives us an example.
From SCLR, we could intervene activities in a different way. It is a break from the traditional way. It is no more a top-down approach. We go to the communities and find community activities and then try to explore possibilities. For an example, villagers were facing severe flood erosion. Land, home, and even livelihood had been threatened by severe erosion. People were trying to protect their banks from the perennial river, dumping this and that natural materials and all. So when talk to them, they wanted certain support like improvisation, and we suggested them some technically advanced method of activity. So that's how we introduced bamboo screening. While resources were raw materials and labor had been supplied by the community, we complemented their activities by supporting them with technical part, and that's how we could protect the community themselves, could protect the village, and besides protecting their banks, they could reclaim land. This is one of many, and these have been furthered by some kind of resilience.
Quality and dignity were linked to support that was holistic, enabled local decision-making, and centered social cohesion. For example, in Turkey, community reported improved mental well-being and a greater sense of resilience as a result of exposure to increased social solidarity, particularly where SCLR supported mutual work between communities that used to be at tension with one another. And finally, relevance was maintained when support was flexible, informed by local and traditional knowledge, and when it promoted wider community involvement. Maria Elena Cerato provides a powerful example from the Philippines.
The principle of bayanihan is deeply embedded in Filipino culture. When you mention bayanihan, many Filipinos picture neighbors literally carrying a house together to transfer it to another place. Everyone lifting, moving in unison, working as one body. It's the spirit of communal unity and cooperation, where neighbors come together to help one another without expecting anything in return. Supporting Community-Led Response, or SCLR, simply provides a framework and tools to strengthen what Filipinos have always done naturally. It's about recognizing that communities are already saving themselves and are the best experts on their own priorities. What's been truly exciting is seeing how local government units, or LGUs, are beginning to recognize the value of this approach. One promising progress is how our partner EcoWeb, a national NGO based in southern Philippines, secured co-funding agreements with 6 LGUs. Each LGU commits 1 to 2 million pesos, or $20,000 to $40,000, which EcoWeb matches with equal funding. This isn't just about money. It's about a fundamental shift in how government works with communities. The question isn't whether government support is good or bad. It's about whether communities can maintain their autonomy and leadership within these partnerships. In Socorro, Siargao, for example, a sea ambulance project started entirely from community resources. Typhoon survivors pooling their own small grants. That collective action was the foundation. Additional funding and government linkages came after, supporting what communities had already initiated. What sustains mutual aid, communities' collective effort, their knowledge of their own priorities, their willingness to organize and act together. External support, including the governments, can contribute to this sustainability when it respects community leadership and doesn't impose rigid structures that undermine local autonomy.
A second key finding is that international support can help demystify common concerns raised by funders when engaging with informal or mutual aid structures. These concerns usually relate to accountability, inclusion, and cost efficiency. The evidence suggests that support to mutual aid can deliver positive results across all of those three areas, challenging assumptions about the limits of informal structures. Accountability concerns often focus on elite capture, corruption, or weak oversight. However, the evidence indicates that accountability can be strengthened when support simplifies upward compliance and prioritizes strong, diverse, and community-led forms of downward accountability. For example, in Sudan, the F system, developed by the emergency response rooms, surprised donors with accountability mechanisms that were often more thorough and grounded than those that donors would have designed themselves. A common inclusion concern is that mutual aid might reproduce existing power dynamics or exclusion. However, the evidence shows that when support promotes inclusive leadership and collective net benefits, particularly through women-led initiatives, it can actually counter exclusion rather than reinforce it. Nancy Khatib from YMCA Palestine, who have been supporting community-led response via protection groups, explains.
Rural and Bedouin communities, women's roles were traditionally limited to household work, like farming and herding, and participation in community protection groups led to profound social transformation. A woman from protection groups, one woman joined a rural protection group as a shy member who rarely spoke. Over time, she began leading discussions, represented her community in meeting with institutions, participated actively in planning processing, negotiated for community rights. She later became a member of the village council and eventually the head of a council committee. She once said, "I didn't only leave my house, I left fear." This transformation resulted in increased trust from men, public support from her family, shifts in social norms, movement from role conflict to partnership. And today, many women who served in protection groups hold position in local councils, serve as council presidents or committee heads, are recognized leaders in planning and risk management. That women's participation in local governance leads to more inclusive and equitable outcomes. The success stories from Palestine prove that inclusion and accountability are not theories. They are roads open, women leading, and communities standing strong. Community protection groups didn't only change projects, they changed people, reshaped how communities see themselves, and proved that when communities lead, they create real and lasting change.
Finally, funders also questioned whether informal structures are cost-effective or can reach economies of scale. However, the evidence suggests that mutual aid groups are often highly efficient at sourcing inputs and implementing activities, and because support builds on existing community action, financial and in-kind contributions from the communities themselves actually frequently exceed external funding. However, despite the largely positive findings, there are several caveats and limitations that need to be considered. Where unintended consequences were identified, they were often linked to cases where support reverted to top-down ways of working. It is also important to note that reporting on unintended consequences was limited, and much of the evidence is self-reported, which raises concerns about possible confirmation bias. And finally, we found very limited discussion on scale, particularly around if support should be scaled, how to scale it, whether you scale it up or out, and how to do this without undermining what makes mutual aid effective in the first place. Now on the findings from the results experienced by those supporting mutual aid. We link this dimension to the system change potential of supporting mutual aid, and I want to explain briefly why. International and formal humanitarian actors usually work within well-established structures. This includes fixed roles, standardized funding mechanisms, compliance requirements, and predefined ideas about leadership, implementation, and accountability. They are also part of a wider system that's shaped through professionalization and specialization, which has produced stable and predictable ways of working that are difficult to shift. However, our data shows that mutual aid follows very different logics. It is fluid, relational, grounded in everyday social life, and able to change form depending on the context and need. This creates a clear mismatch because in order to genuinely support mutual aid, international actors cannot simply fit it into existing categories. They often need to rethink their own roles, relationships, and operating rules. So our hypothesis is that while these shifts begin at the program or pilot level, over time, some may influence internal organizational practices. And if enough interconnected actors change in similar ways, and if these changes accumulate across organizations supporting mutual aid, this could contribute to a gradual reconfiguration of the international humanitarian system. So the core question for us is whether and to what extent and how support to mutual aid can contribute to system change or system reset. Evidence on this dimension was much more limited, but there are some promising early signals. Changes were observed in how organizations learn, make decisions, build partnerships, and engage in advocacy as a result of supporting mutual aid. Learning became more adaptive and multidirectional, including peer-to-peer learning and learning from community practices. Decision-making shifted in terms of who influences, how and when support is provided, including shifts between donors, INGOs, national actors, and communities. Partnerships became more trust-based and equitable, and advocacy efforts increasingly focused on promoting SCLR and broader system reform. Ndalkacha Yargel, director of the national organization Citizen to Citizen in Ethiopia, explains how supporting mutual aid has influenced their own work.
You know, in my country, Ethiopia, facing multiple crises that are including climate shocks, civil conflict, displacement, and chronic food insecurity. Yet even in those challenges, people continue to show remarkable solidarity by sharing resources, supporting one another, and rebuilding together. This pushed us to rethink the aid delivery system, moving away from top-down approach to embrace citizen-driven systems that foster local capacity and solidarity. The experience has led us C2C, citizen to citizen, fully embrace SCLR approach, which now we see communities not as a beneficiary but as a leader. Our role is to catalyzing their strengths, respect their agency, and protect the space for local innovation to thrive, with the vision to create a resilient community that confidently shapes their own future. Instead of asking them to participate in our project, we ask to participate in theirs. Peer-to-peer learning is now spreading organically. Groups visit one another and sharing methods and adapting ideas and inspiring communities. We advocate for policies that empower mutual aid groups, reduce dependency, and build the future with resilience. A system that recognizes their agency and supports their leadership for long-term development is critically important.
Despite the positive findings once again, there are key evidence gaps that remain. First of all, there is limited evidence of changes in technical areas that are critical to localization, such as compliance, due diligence, and accountability system. Also, most documented changes are still at the pilot and SCLR level, with very little evidence of organizational and system-wide transformation. And finally, the evidence primarily reflects changes amongst local and national organizations, with far less documented changes among international actors. We know that this has been a lot of information, and the report itself has a lot more details and examples. But if there are 4 key messages that you should take away from this first report, is that first, the current attention on mutual aid appears justified by the promising evidence that we identified in this synthesis. Second, supporting mutual aid may not only help prioritize scarce international funding, but could also contribute to resetting how the system operates towards a more people-centered and locally led one. Third, the outcomes experienced by mutual aid depend not just on how much support or funding is provided, but on how that support is designed and delivered. And finally, and most importantly, as support grows, it must be accompanied by independent and critical analysis to ensure that it does not end up undermining what makes mutual aid effective in the first place.